and say, take down a tweet. Did I hear that correct, Mr. Roth?
That was my understanding, yes.
Yeah. So on May 27th, 2020, President Donald J. Trump tweeted, and I quote, "Republicans feel that social media platforms totally silence conservatives." By the way, something that would come as news to you, apparently, Mr. Roth, because you're still the subject of conservative harassment. "We will strongly regulate," he went on to say, "or close them down before we ever allow this to happen," unquote. Ms. Navaroli, doesn't that sound eerily like a government official telling Twitter that there's a threat, we'll shut you down if we don't like the content?
I am not familiar with the tweet that you have referenced.
Well, but if I just told you that quote without telling you who said it, might it have some ominous overtones from your point of view if you're still at Twitter? We'll shut you down. We'll regulate you. We will never allow this to happen. Those are pretty strong words.
They are.
Yeah. Okay. On September 8th, 2019, at 11:11 p.m., Donald Trump heckled two celebrities on Twitter, John Legend and his wife, Chrissy Teigen, and referred to them as the musician John Legend and his filthy-mouthed wife, unquote. Ms. Teigen responded to that email at 12:17 a.m., and according to notes from a conversation with you, Ms. Navaroli's counsel, your counsel, the White House almost immediately thereafter contacted Twitter to demand the tweet be taken down. Is that accurate?
Thank you for the question. In my role, I was not responsible for receiving any sort of request from the government. However, what I was privy to was my supervisors letting us know that we had received something along those lines or something of a request. In that particular instance, I do remember hearing that we had received a request from the White House to make sure that we evaluated this tweet and that they wanted it to come down because it was a derogatory statement directed towards the president.
They wanted it to come down. They made that request.
To my recollection, yes.
I thought that was an inappropriate action by a government official, let alone the White House. But it wasn't Joe Biden about his son's laptop. It was Donald Trump because he didn't like what Chrissy Teigen had to say about him. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
My. You ever think it's appropriate for the President of the United States to direct or otherwise influence a social media company to take down its content?
I think it's a very slippery slope.
Mr. Roth, Ms. Gaddy, Mr. Baker, any evidence that Joe Biden's ever done that?
Certainly none that I'm aware of, no.
I don't recall anything like that.
I'm sorry, that President Biden did what, sir?
Has Joe Biden ever called Twitter, to your knowledge, or his White House at his behest, to take down content or urge you to take down content?
I don't know the answer to that question, sir.
Well, I'm going to have to conclude at least from 3 of the 4, you don't know. There's no evidence he's ever done that, but there's plenty of evidence Donald J. Trump tried to do that. And if we're going to have a hearing about the misuse of social media and the intrusion of government in the content on social media, we've got an environment-rich target, but it's not Joe Biden. It's Donald J. Trump, and of course, we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about Russian bots and Russian fabrications using fake accounts on Twitter to a political purpose, and it's not to help elect Democrats. And we don't want to talk about 4 years of Donald Trump manipulating the truth and trying to manipulate social media and threaten it, or directly to try to shape it by taking down content because it was critical of him personally. And that's what we ought to be talking about as we move forward, not the subject of today's hearing. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Donalds for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quick, Mr. Roth.
Just 20 seconds. I'll maybe pose a quick question to Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, the opening statement, there's been a lot of talk about the memorandum from Attorney General Garland on October 21st, 2021. The opening statement, he says, the very first sentence, in recent months, there's been a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, threats of violence against school administrators. And when he testified on October 21st, 2021, we asked him, what was the basis, what was the evidence for that statement? Do you remember what the Attorney General said?
Sir, I don't. I don't work for the Justice Department anymore. Didn't advise him on it.
Well, I'll remind you. He said it was the letter from the National School Boards Association. Now, do you happen to know what the National School Boards Association did with their letter, what they said about their letter after the Attorney General testified?
Sir, I do not.
They rescinded it. They said, we regret and apologize for the letter. So the basis for the targeting action involving the federal government and local school board matters, local law enforcement matters, the basis was the letter. That's what the Attorney General cited, and that letter has been pulled back, and the association who sent that letter said, we apologize and regret that we sent it. Seems to me the Attorney General should rescind his memorandum, which we've called for now for a year and a half. Thank the Chairman. Look forward, the Democrats tell us. Focus on the future. Might have started in a lab, might have happened in nature. But here's the question I keep coming up with. If it may have been a lab, may have been nature, we're supposed to look forward, then why did Dr. Fauci work so hard for just one of those theories? Why was it so important to push one over the other? Dr. Barra said, we should entertain all hypotheses. Dr. Fauci had his hypothesis, how this started. We should entertain all of them. But that's not what happened. That is definitely not what happened. 3 years ago, if you thought it came from a lab, if you raised that, you were called a nut job. You got censored on Twitter. You were blacklisted on Twitter. You were even called a crackpot by the very scientist who in late January sent emails to Dr. Fauci and said it came from a lab. They called you crackpot. Is that right, Dr. Redfield?
I think the most upsetting thing to me was the Baltimore Sun calling me a racist because I said this came from a Wuhan lab.
Dr. Redfield, you ran the CDC and you were on the coronavirus task force. Is that right?
Correct.
That was formed on January 29th, 2020. Is that right?
Correct.
2 days later, Dr. Fauci gets an email from Dr. Anderson which says what? Virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory. Is that accurate?
That's my understanding.
Next day, I know. Did he share that email with you, by the way, Dr. Redfield?
No.
As a member of the task force, as the head of CDC, did he share that email with you?
No.
Okay. Next day, February 1st, Dr. Gary sends Dr. Fauci another email. That email says, I don't know how this happens in nature, but it would be easy to do in a lab. Did he share that email with you, Dr. Redfield?
No.
You didn't see either one of those emails, even though you're head of CDC, even though you're on the coronavirus task force that had been formed just 3 days earlier.
No.
3 days later, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Gary, who told us it came from a lab in emails to Dr. Fauci that Dr. Fauci wouldn't let Dr. Redfield see, 3 days later, they changed their position 180 degrees. The question is why? Mr. Wade, why would they change their position that fast when the only intervening event is a conference call with Dr. Fauci, the guy who wouldn't let Dr. Redfield see the very emails that they had sent him, Dr. Redfield, head of CDC on the coronavirus task force? Why would they change their position, Dr. Wade, or Mr. Wade?
Well, this question does lie at the heart of the issue. What is pertinent, it seems to me, is there's no new scientific evidence that we can see that came available between these dates, the January 31st and Feb 4.
Right. There's no new. I think you're. Go ahead.
So you have to ask if there were other kinds of influence available. Now, it is true that Dr. Fauci and Dr. Farry in London were very powerful research officials, and between them they controlled.
I read your testimony. I saw that. Yeah.
So
why don't you cut to the chase and tell them what you really think was the reason?
I don't know what the reason was.
I know what it was.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I'll let you say it because I read your testimony. I think you said it in your testimony too. Maybe you're reluctant to say it here, but go ahead.
Well, if you're looking at the timeline, on May 21st, just a few weeks after the Nature Medicine article had come out, two of the signatories of the original email to Dr. Fauci, that's Dr. Anderson and Dr. Gary, were awarded a $9 million grant for the.
So there's 9 million reasons why they changed their mind. I knew you'd get to it. I read that last night. 3 months after So 3 days after they say it came from a lab, they changed their position, and the only intervening event's a conference call with Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins. Again, a call that Mr. Redfield was not allowed to be on, the head of CDC and on the coronavirus task force. And then 3 months later, shazam, they get $9 million from Dr. Fauci. Well, isn't that something? Isn't that something? That's why we want to talk to these guys. That's why Chairman Winstrup wants to bring in Dr. Anderson and Dr. Gary and ask them a series of questions so we can get to the bottom of this, so we can move forward and deal with this. Now, here's the key question. Look, I'm just a common sense guy from Ohio. I majored in wrestling in college, but I got a degree in economics. You're supposed to get a degree when you go to college. I got one in economics. And one of the things they tell you about is a thing called opportunity cost. So when you're spending your time making sure that the country believes only one of these theories, you could have been doing what Dr. Redfield was doing in our government, trying to figure out how we deal with this virus. And what was Dr. Fauci doing? He was trying to cover his backside, and everybody knows it. And that's a part that ticks us off, because this is the highest paid guy in our government getting all kinds of money to tell us things that were not accurate. Because we now know U.S. tax dollars went to a lab in China, a lab that was not up to code, a lab that was doing gain-of-function research, and that's where this thing most definitely came from. And Dr. Fauci had to prove, no, he can't have that news getting out. And that's why he did what he did, to the exclusion of a brilliant guy running our CDC, kept him out of the loop. Keeping him out of the loop probably potentially could have harmed America. That's the thing that ticks us all off. And that's why, Mr. Chairman, this hearing is so darn important, and we get to the bottom of really what happened.